Okay, it's inevitable. Can you hear me? Question. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, right. It's a real pleasure to talk at this event today. My introduction to archaeology was pre-Time Team. Time Team didn't come on till the year after I graduated. But I was a precocious 11-year-old, and I used to ask my mum lots of questions about archaeology. So she ended up doing an evening course in archaeology, and Oxford was our nearest place. So seeing people like Trevor Rowley and James Bond, I remember going for a walk in the country to look at some medieval sites as a very short 11-year-old, and it's a 12-mile hike through the clay lands of Oxfordshire, which nearly killed me. And then a few years later, when I was a sixth former, I did work experience with the Royal Commission and Carenza. I spent a couple of days in Wiltshire, kind of mainly hiding from the rain. But that really got me into archaeology, and obviously reading mixed books was so important as an undergraduate. And now for my sins, I'm head of admissions for our departments, and I get to read all the student statements. And even now, 4 or 5 years after Time Team came to an end, students, aspiring archaeology students, are still citing Time Team as something that's important. Because although it's not being made still, it's there on YouTube, it's there on endless repeats on television, and it's still a really important inspiration for people who are coming into universities today. Now, but I'm here really to talk about Lindisfarne. It's quite nice. Everywhere I dig, Time Team normally seems to get here first. So I spent 9 years digging at a Roman site called Binchester, which Time Team got there first. I'm now here, and Time Team dug a site the other side of the village called the Palace. So it's a kind of, I've got to work my way through all the series. I'm not sure if I'll get the work done before I retire. Hopefully, can everyone see that okay? Can everyone see the picture? So I'll get someone at the back to do the light magic. So I want to talk about Lindisfarne. I want to talk about early medieval Lindisfarne. For most people, this is what they may think about when they hear about Lindisfarne and people talk about Lindisfarne. So Lindisfarne Gospels, these amazing early 8th century illuminated manuscript books. If a book could be a World Heritage Site, I think the Lindisfarne Gospels would definitely be one. And one of the first things I want you to think about when we're trying to talk about Lindisfarne is to get away from the idea that we're on the edge. We're up in the north, we're 10 miles from the Scottish border. It's very easy to think of Lindisfarne as being somewhere on the periphery. But of course, that Scottish border doesn't even come into place until exactly 1,000 years ago, 1018, the Battle of Carham. Before that, we are in the centre, and I think we need to think about Northumbria, Northumberland, and Lindisfarne as not being northern England, but central Britain. We're in a part of the main British mainland where we look north, we look west, and we look south. We're not just in the Anglo Saxon world. We're at that amazing cultural hinge point where where the monks of Lindisfarne were able to engage with lots of different flows of cultures. It's not just an Anglo Saxon monastery. Whoop. Let's get back to the island. Yes, one of the first things, though, when we're looking at the monastery, we need to strip away what we know about the island today. When you come onto the island today, you will have arrived, well, most of you, I imagine, would have arrived by driving over the causeway from Beal and along the long sand dunes of the Snook. That causeway was only set in stone, as it were, in the middle of the 20th century. And we don't have to go very far back in time to realise that actually the main route onto the island was not that causeway from Beal, but actually the main causeway to the island came straight down Marygate. That's the main drag you'll have all come across, straight off the edge of the island, straight over to the mainland to a place called Fenham, which is the centre of the monastery's major landed estates. So people like Cuthbert coming to the island would have come along that very direct route straight to the village. Another feature of the island's topography, of course, are the sand dunes. And again, we need to strip those away. Those sand dunes only really emerge in the late medieval and early post-medieval period as a result of the stormy weather conditions of the Little Ice Age. So again, when we're thinking about what the island would have been like for the early medieval monks, we need to remember that those sand dunes wouldn't have been there. And it would have made the island even lower lying. We don't have a lot of relief on the island, but a lot of the relief we do have is caused by those sand dunes. So you need to mentally imagine those away. And finally, we need to understand that the area around the harbour has changed. Nowadays, it's very regularly photographed little harbour. You look across to the castle, across on the crag. But if you go back into, again, only into the 18th century, and you can see from these photos, there's actually a very large area which was now it's still very, very soggy, but until the 18th century, the water more or less came up to the edge of that damp green patch, which would have made the site of the Anglo Saxon monastery much more of a really distinctly defined headland with water on three sides. So again, we need to do a little bit of creative reimagination to think about what the landscape would have been like. I want to try and divide the story of Lindisfarne, or early medieval Lindisfarne, into three ages, three periods. So I think when you look at the history and the archaeology, it's very clear that there are three distinct chapters in the story. Now, the earliest chapter is, of course, the first 30 years following its foundation. It was founded by an Anglo Saxon king, Oswald. He had been the heir to the Northumbrian throne, which is very bad for your health, because people want to kill you. So he'd spent his early years in exile in Western Scotland, where he converted to an Irish tradition of Christianity, probably at the great Irish-influenced monastery of Iona off the west coast of Mull. And when he assumed the rule of Northumberland, he brought Irish monks with him, including the key figure Aidan, and in 635 he established the new monastery here at Lindisfarne. And it's very hard to resist the idea that in coming to Lindisfarne and setting up a monastery here, he is building himself a new Iona. He's creating himself an Iona over here in the east. He created other monasteries as well. He created a monastery at Hartlepool, which you wouldn't know it today, was also a small tidal island. So the importance of these coastal locations was incredibly important. Also, I think one of the lucky things for Oswald and Aidan when they came here is in some ways the landscape of Lindisfarne does mirror that of Iona. Most notably, anyone who's been to Iona will know there's this rocky crag, the Toran Abba, which had Columba's cell on top of it, which looked down onto the monastery below. And in many ways, I think that's something I think was exploited when they came here, because the craggy hoof, the craggy windsill outcrop on the southwest corner of the island, looks down onto where the main monastery is in exactly the same way. There's these lovely kind of echoes and resonances of Iona here at Lindisfarne, which I think the monks exploited. We do have real challenges, though, in trying to reach back into this earliest period of the archaeology of Lindisfarne. And so far, although there's been lots of great work by ourselves and other archaeologists on the island, I've yet to see anything which I think really strikes me as belonging to that very earliest phase, that very early mid-7th century. And there's lots of problems. Archaeology is not an easy subject. If you go and dig a Roman site, Romans are great. Romans are brilliant for archaeologists. They have loads of finds and lots of straight walls. So it makes our lives very easy. Once you get into the early medieval period, life gets much, much more difficult. And one of the problems we have, particularly looking at the archaeology of this part of the world, is finding ways of dating the past. So even if I did find some what looked like very early phases at somewhere like Lindisfarne, how do I date them? Carbon-14, yes, that's relatively useful, but it only gives us quite broad periods. It doesn't home in on an individual year. If I look at other monasteries like Iona, or the great Northumbrian monastery over in Dumfries and Galloway at Whithorn, they have life a little bit easier than we do here, because they have finds. They actually have ceramics and glass, particularly glass and ceramics imported by the great Atlantic trade routes from the Mediterranean and from Western Gaul. So this is some of that early medieval glass from Whithorn. And that's reasonably datable. But again, here at Lindisfarne, in this earliest phase, we are neither in the world of the Atlantic trade networks bringing those things up from the Mediterranean and Western Gaul. Equally, we're too far north to be part of the great North Sea trade network, which connected trading sites and trading emporias across the east and south of England over with northern France, the Low Countries and Germany. So we have real problems. We also don't seem to have any really early sculpture. If one goes to look at the huge, great collection of sculpture, go and have a look in the visitor centre, there's lots of amazing sculpture. But none of it seems to date from that very early period, that mid-7th century, when really the tradition of creating sculpture out of stone has yet to really pick up. So we have real challenges in picking up a 30-year phase of archaeology where we have no datable objects and no sculpture. And just to make things really complicated, everything will be constructed in wood, including the churches. So there's lots of methodological challenges in actually trying to unpick that archaeology. But as we move on, things get a little bit easier. In 664, King Oswy, King of Northumberland, he brings together the major church people in his realm. They have to make a decision about whether Northumberland wants to follow the Irish path of Christianity from Iona, or whether it wants to follow the Roman path of Christianity derived from the Augustan mission to convert the Anglo Saxons through Kent and the Frankish realms, and ultimately directly with Rome. Because at that point, those two traditions are operating side by side in Northumbria. This causes domestic tension. The king of Northumbria, is feasting at Easter, while his wife and her servants are still fasting. So at the very least, it's not a recipe for domestic harmony. But it's also, again, it's a bigger decision about which way is Northumbria going to face. Is it going to face towards the Anglo-Saxon world and that Roman tradition, or is it going to face and look west and north to the Irish, the Scots, the Picts, and the British of Strathclyde? Oswy decides to go with the Romans. He decides to align his kingdom with the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south. So we see a major change at Lindisfarne. Coleman, the bishop who'd fought for the Irish position at the synod, he can't accept the decision. He takes his monks, or many of his monks, and he leaves. He goes back to Iona and then to the west of Ireland, where he founds a couple of monasteries. So instead, there's a need for a new ideologically correct administration to come into the monastery. And it's soon after that we see Cuthbert coming in. Of course, Cuthbert is the figure who's most associated with Lindisfarne. He's a nobleman, he's from the Scottish borders. He joins the church at Melrose, and he's on the graduate career path very, very quickly. He becomes very successful within the church. He's an administrator, he's an effective organizer, but also he always has that yearning to be a hermit, that yearning for isolation and solitude. He ultimately becomes the abbot and bishop of Lindisfarne, but ends up his days over on Innerfarne, the island you can see over there. If it's not raining, on a good day you can see the island over there, where he dies, and he comes back. His body is brought back to Lindisfarne, and he's carefully buried in the most honourable position next to the altar. 10 years later, at the end of the 7th century, he is dug back up. And lo and behold, Bede's very clear about this. They were expecting to find bones, and they didn't. They found the miraculously preserved corpse of Cuthbert. And that is a point in which Cuthbert becomes the key cult figure for Lindisfarne. He becomes their logo, their brand. He becomes the person which is associated with the monastery, and still is. His body is raised up in a wooden shrine above the ground, and that process, which the Anglo-Saxons called translatio, or translation, that is how you make an Anglo-Saxon saint. You don't have paperwork, it's by acclamation. And from that point, Cuthbert becomes a figure which brings people and land and money to Holy Island. And it's that point where the stock of Lindisfarne really starts to rise. It becomes the most powerful, the most wealthy centre of Christianity in central Britain, but perhaps the only real rival being Iona itself. And this affects the archaeology. This is when we can start to see and identify and recognise what looks like the archaeological record of the island. Now, most of you who've had a chance to go over and look at the churches will see that the Priory Church is kind of more or less on the same alignment as the parish church. So here's the plan of the Priory Church, and here's our parish church underneath. And that kind of planning, that kind of layout of churches is absolutely typical of the Anglo-Saxon Roman tradition. And I think this is what I think we're seeing here. I think we're seeing that the new administration making a statement in stone about this is no longer an Irish monastery, this is an Anglo-Saxon and Roman monastery. So they start laying out churches. And underneath most of the fabric in the churches today, it seems to be much later. Earlier excavation in the early 20th century did show what looks like a stone church underlying the Priory Church. And that's one of the things we're going to be doing on Sunday with Jimmy. We're going to be going out and doing ground-penetrating radar to actually see whether we can actually find that church. And that church may well be the great church in which Cuthbert himself was buried. Other things have suddenly started coming turning up on the island. Obviously, we've got the Dig Ventures Durham University project. That's been another project funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. We've been so important in funding archaeology, doing archaeology in the area. And many of you will have seen this up on the hoof, up on the rocky crag. They have found what seems to be a stone-built church. Now, as I said, the buildings from the earliest days will all have been wood. So the fact it's built out of stone means it probably dates to this second phase at least. Now again, the Anglo Saxons are making things difficult for the archaeologists. There's nothing to date this. All we can do is date it on its broad shape and broad plan. And we're thinking about ways maybe we could use scientific dating to date this. But it's interesting, so it reminds us that there would be multiple churches. The monastery of Lindisfarne would have been big. Not like the little compact priory we see today, but big, covering probably the whole village. It would have had lots of churches, lots of cemeteries, lots of buildings for all the farmers and the lay tenants. Lots of people would be living here. So to find this up on the hoof is a reminder that this early medieval archaeology isn't just restricted to a little area round by the priory. And here you can see that excavation of the church. Other things being found up along this rocky crag, and there's lots of earthworks there which have barely been investigated. And then recently, another excavation up on that rocky crag has found Anglo-Saxon burials, one with Anglo-Saxon sculpture in his grave. And these have produced carbon-14 dates of, broadly speaking, the 9th century. So again, we're starting to fill out, we're starting to flesh out the plan of that Anglo-Saxon monastery. And one of the challenges has been, and one of the things that always surprises me, is how little archaeology there had been done here in the past. Iona has been cut to ribbons by archaeologists. But here, we're an hour from Newcastle, we're an hour from Edinburgh, lots of archaeologists in the local area. There's been relatively little research done here. So we're very much in this early stage of just trying to work out what there is and where it is and when it dates for. It's a lot of very, very basic research. So with Dig Ventures and Durham University, one of the first things we did when we started thinking about working here is we got some money from the National Geographic and we did a great big geophysical survey. We found all sorts of things all over the island. There's lots of medieval ridge and furrow, lots of medieval landscape archaeology. We found an extra cloister to the monastery because it had two, just in case, had a spare cloister. But we also found very clearly lots of, we technically call them features, or we tend to call them splodges in practice, areas of activity, things happening to the east of the Priory Church. Now, this could have been anything. It could have been related to the later medieval church, could have been related to the Tudor defence of the island, it could have been even related to World War II defences. So we decided to put in some little evaluation trenches, the small scale kind of things you'd see on Time Team, just to clarify what we've got. And really pleasingly, when we got into the ground, when we got that fieldwork done, we realised very quickly we were coming down on top of an Anglo-Saxon cemetery. And after initial small-scale poking around in the first year, over the last 2 years, we've been expanding our trenches. And it's been really paying dividends. It's clear we're coming down on a big, long-term use, lots of graves cutting through each other, burial site. Our carbon-14 dates so far suggest broadly the 8th, 9th, 10th century. It's starting to give us a real sense of who the people were here. The HLF project found the church. We've got the congregation. And by looking at the bone, we can start to tell things about it. First of all, these aren't the monks, because there's women and there's children. You could be a 7-year-old and be a monk, but we've got children considerably younger than that. They're buried in that classic kind of, what becomes a classic way of Christian burial, head to the west, feet to the east. We've got no grave goods, we've got no burial items, apart from lots of quartz pebbles. Thousands of quartz pebbles seem to be associated with our graves. These are beautiful, tactile things. They glisten, they glow when they get wet. And they are really commonly placed on graves in what you might call central Britain and the north. You find it in many other cemeteries. And they would have marked out and defined the graves of the people who are being buried there. We've also, many of you will recognise this is the namestone that we found in 2016. There's about 12 of these, there were about 12 of these known on the island previously. These are tiny little things. These are little grave markers, and we have a name. In this case, we have the name Uthfrith or Utfrith written on it. And that was really one of our favourite finds of that first season. And then we came back last year, and we were convinced we were going to find more, and we didn't find any. But one of the things I'm really proud to say is this year we found that. Wow, I didn't know it was going to spin around. We got another one. We've got another one. That's going to keep on spinning. And we've got another one, and they all spin, which is a very good value. So we found a whole series of these pieces of Anglo Saxon sculpture. Now, some of them, it takes the eye of faith, but in a raking light, and you compare it with other ones we know, we can see it's a good example of one of these little namestones. So you've got to imagine our burials with quartz pebbles, some defined by stone curbs, perhaps with these little namestones sitting at the end, naming the person who died. And of course, these would have been colourful. These would have been painted. These would have been kind of perhaps a little bit lurid to our eyes, but they would have given us it helps us to think about how these graves looked. We tend to see just the skeletons in the holes, but that's just one part of the bigger process. So these would have been really interesting, colourful places where families and people could come and visit and relate to these graves. And perhaps with the quartz pebbles, these are being picked up by people coming, and they'll place them on the grave as a kind of act of commemoration. It's not the only piece of sculpture we got in our first year. Here we got this very interesting piece. Again, it's a bit fragmentary, but it's completely different from anything else from Northumberland or County Durham. It only has parallels really with Western Scotland and even Ireland. This having a central stem with two crosses either side is completely not found where we are here. And we've always been trying to understand this piece of sculpture. It's always been, I've always been very, very fond of this. I felt it got a bit overshadowed by the other namestone. And then really pleasingly, again, about a week ago, we got the top half. It's archaeological jigsaw puzzles. It's about 4 meters away, but it allows us to, again, reconstruct this object. And what's really interesting, this kind of inset, I suppose what you might call armpits on the cross. That kind of cross is absolutely typical of the sculpture of Lindisfarne, and you find that kind of cross reproduced again and again and again. So to find this object, which kind of encapsulates a really strong Lindisfarne identity, but also looks west to Ireland and Scotland, has been a really nice reminder again of these long distance connections of somewhere like Holy Land. Yeah, this is one you're going to have to squint here. This is our early medieval burials. Not all about death. We've also got about the archaeology of life here, and we have an early medieval building. Now, the Anglo Saxons, by the 8th century, they start making life a little bit easier for archaeologists, and they start having buildings where the walls are defined by stone pads on which either you have timber verticals or maybe a horizontal timber base plate placed on that. We've started unpicking that. We have what looks like might be an oven, and you'll be able to see it on site if you come and visit. There might be an oven there. We've got a pit which looks like it might be used to slake lime. There's lots of animal bone around here. The 8th century monks are eating oysters and whelks and periwinkles, as long as sheep and goats. And also they're quite partial to a bit of seal. We found several butchered seal bones. They're basically big fish sausage. And you can imagine a lot of oil, a lot of resources can come out of a seal. They make good eating, but they also make good rope out of the hides. So that gives us an idea of how they're living. It's not just looking at the dead. We've got a sense of how people actually lived day to day in the monastery. And they're not spending all their time making illuminated manuscripts or getting up at 4 o'clock. They're doing things like cooking and building and making food and rendering down seals to make oil for their oil lamps. So you've got to imagine an Anglo Saxon monastery. It's a place full of life. It smells, probably a lot of smells. It's got rendering down seals. Butchery, noise. It would have been a very kind of vibrant place to be. Probably would have been one of the biggest population centres in this part of the country. And again, we're starting to get objects. We've got a little bit of a spindle whorl from that building. We've got a little bead, which is so small I couldn't get a decent photograph of it. We're also getting coins, and these are great because they do help us date stuff. So this is a coin of King Ethelred II. This is not Ethelred the Unready. This is another Ethelred who, whenever you look him up, always says little-known Northumbrian king. And all we know is that he was a Northumbrian king, he got killed, and he issued coinage. And that's literally all we know about him. But his coinage in the 9th century is reaching places like Lindisfarne. This is the bit everyone always knows about Lindisfarne, the Vikings, the Viking Attack. This is a stone that is shown on every single National Geographic documentary about the Vikings. It's in every school book. The only problem is it's probably made in the late 10th or early 11th century, and we don't know they're actually Vikings. But let's not get in the way of a good story. The first attack is 793. Vikings come in literally and metaphorically out of the blue. Then there's a pause, but the tempo of Viking attacks increase in the 9th century. And the monks start to leave. And we have this lovely story that the monks, they take one of the churches and literally dismantle it. They take one of the great stone crosses, they take the relics of Cuthbert, and they move inland. And the story is they're trying to escape the terrifying Vikings. You've got this idea of poor cowering monks and scary big Vikings. And the story seems to go, but they move first to Norham, inland, up the Tweed, then down to Crake in Yorkshire, up to Chester Street. But in Durham, they end up in AD 995. And this is what you find in all the history books. The trouble is, this story is starting to come apart. This is entirely based on stuff written by Norman historians after it all happened. Wonderful work by a guy called Neil McGuigan at St Andrews University is actually trying to think, what does the history of Lindisfarne actually look like if we actually use documents from when the monastery was actually there? And they're starting to make some really interesting suggestions that actually it was always, Norham was always perhaps the key place after Lindisfarne. Actually, Chester Street didn't really figure in the history. There's a great list of where the saints are buried, written in the 11th century, which says that Cuthbert, by that point, Cuthbert should be in Durham. But actually what it's saying is Cuthbert's at Norham, or under Ubbenford is the other name for Norham. So actually it's starting to suggest that what the story we're always told about the long-term life of Lindisfarne is perhaps a little bit inaccurate. The Norman monks of Durham are kind of elaborating, they like a good story. And I think they're reworking their sources to put a very particular point of view through. We also have to go back, which leads us to go back and think about the archaeology. We've got all this lovely sculpture, most of the sculpture from Holy Island dates to the point after which the monks are meant to have gone. And this has always been this kind of elephant in the room no one's ever talked about. And these, I mean, we're not just talking little tiny bits of sculpture, we're talking great big things like, these are big elaborate cross shafts showing animals, showing religious scenes. We've got knot work going on. Actually, this looks like some of this is Anglo-Scandinavian Viking style carving as well. But the key thing is there are people at Lindisfarne in the 10th century who are able to make these things, and in the Anglo-Saxon world they're always made in a church context. People who are coming to Lindisfarne and commissioning these things, the skills there, the demands there. There must be people still here living a monastic and religious life. Whilst the head office may have moved, Lindisfarne still remains the centre for early medieval, for monasticism. And that's one of our other big questions. Now, I said I'd come back to the church as well. This is a wonderful photo by the architectural historian Peter Ryder, looking at the chancel end of the arch of St Mary's Parish Church. And there's this lovely 12th century pointy arch. That's absolutely fine. But you can see there's this earlier round-headed arch. So people always think round-headed arches, that's Romanesque, that's Norman. But it's not. Round-headed arches are there in the Anglo-Saxon world. And really interesting, if you look at this arch, it's just defined by simple strips of stone. There's no fancy Romanesque carving or anything. And that fits as well in a late Anglo-Saxon context as it does in the Norman context. What's even more interesting, if you look at this, you can see we've got these small flat stones, which seem to be associated with the round-headed arch, and then these bigger stones, which seem to predate that arch. So it looks like there's multiple phases of church surviving in that really interesting piece of the later parish church. And one might feasibly squeeze it all in to the Norman period just about, but it's much more comfortable to understand this as one, maybe two phases of pre-Norman architecture still surviving in the parish church. Now, whether the monks leave and go to Norham for a long time or just stop at Norham on a bigger path, they do end up in Durham. And by the 11th century, they are in Durham. And then the Normans come, the monasteries are reorganized, and there's this kind of coming back of full circle. And the Romanesque priory we see standing there on the island, which is upstanding buildings, that's a late 11th or 12th century foundation. It's the monks kind of returning to their roots. And if you look at the church which stands in the priory ruins, it's a mini Durham cathedral. It's making those links with Durham through stone. And it's a really interesting way how they actually use architecture and history books and sculpture all to make and perpetuate those links between Holy Island and Durham. So I just have to share this. We had 24 bishops turning up on the islands last week or the week before, and they all marched past the trench. I think there's probably more bishops since. Never been as many bishops since the Anglo Saxon period. Also, what you don't see is there is a twirly gate on the path about kind of 50 yards there, which they hadn't factored in. And it's the point at which we reached peak Father Ted, is when you watch 24 bishops with incense trying to get through a spinning gate. But one of them had the decency to bless our trenches as we went past. But what I'm trying to say, the key message though, is we still have questions. When we do archaeology, we're asking questions. We don't just dig. We don't just say, let's just dig a hole and see what happens. We're asking questions. And I think as we move into future years, we've got a list of things we'd like to find out. We want to know more about this murky 10th century. Can we pick it up in the archaeology of our areas? For example, and there's potential. We have a burial slapped straight through our building. If our building's 8th century, what date's that burial? Does that help us to identify the population on the island? Sculpture. Can we date it? How do you date sculpture? It all has to be done stylistically. Very little sculpture is ever found in archaeological contexts. Can we really start to drill down and work out when sculpture is being made and how do we do it? And the great thing is we are finding sculpture associated with cemeteries. So we can at least do carbon-14 dating on the burials. That's one way we can prise the lid off the conundrum of dealing with sculpture. And finally, Lindisfarne the monastery was never isolated. Get away from the idea of monks staring out into the ocean communing with puffins. This is a big corporation. They own huge amounts of land. They own, obviously, the whole island. So we want to look at how that island developed. There's other amazing early medieval sites on the island. I'm sure as we unpick the geoarchaeology, we're going to find more things. So these are all the kind of things we're moving on to. And places like the castle, post-medieval castle, was it being used in the early medieval period? It looks, my kind of thumbs twitch when I get near it. I feel early medieval when I go near that castle. So we're going to try and explore whether we can do work over there. So I just really want to finish off. The thing about Lindisfarne, the thing which always strikes me, is they've got very poor press nowadays. There's this idea that there's all this great community of wealth which was destroyed by the Vikings. And I think that's really unfair. If you think about this on the big picture, by the time we get to the Norman period, Vikings are more or less gone. Eric Bloodaxe dies at the battle at Stainmore up on the bleak passes in the 10th century. By the time you get to the Norman period, the kings of Northumbria, with their great palace over at Bamborough, they're gone. But the one group of people who survive, not just into the Norman period, but all the way through to the dissolution of the monasteries in Henry VIII, is the community of St. Cuthbert. It's that body of monks and scholars who have their origin here in 635, in the 7th century, with that move over of the Irish monks. They stay here, they maintain their identity, they hold on to the relics of Cuthbert, and finally end up in Durham. And they are, in practice, the most powerful body, corporation, political unit, whatever you want to call it, in the north of England. through much of the medieval period. Just think, when those monks, when they moved to Durham, they're not moving away from Vikings, they're moving towards Vikings, the Viking city and Viking kingdom of York. These are not monks running away. These are monks with resilience and power and probably an army who are able to stand up to the Vikings. They may have lost a couple of battles, but in the long term, it's the monks of Lindisfarne that survive. Okay, thank you very much.
Take questions. You have to take questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there anything that anybody would like to ask Dave? Yes, gentleman there.
It's a name that Bede uses. Obviously, you've got the Farne Islands over there, so it's a name which is associated not just with the islands, but with the island groups. I have yet to see a convincing attempt to explain it, to be honest. There are various attempts. The Lindis bit, some people have connected to Lindsey in the kingdom of Anglo Saxon kingdom of Lincolnshire. Also, some people say that the name of a little stream on the island was called the Lindis. Your guess is as good as mine. The trouble is, most parts of the country have lovely volumes of place names of people who've done a huge amount of documentary research. For Northumberland, it's 1920. So we're crying out for place name scholarship. So the fact that even somewhere as important as Lindisfarne remains unexplained is a bit worrying.
Anybody else? Lady down here.
At the moment, we still don't have a case of a grave with a building on top. What we have is a building with a grave cut through it. But we're still going down. Now, this is the joys of archaeology. It's like taking it down. And as I've been saying to the dig venturers, is if we knew what it was, we wouldn't have to dig it. So we're always being surprised. I'm fairly sure that we're going to find more graves underneath those buildings. And that gives us chronology and relationships, which is fantastic. Someone else? I suspect that most of the village has Anglo-Saxon monastery underneath it. But that also includes things like areas of green space, the field, the paddocks. There's a little bit of commercial archaeology was done opposite the coach park, which is far side of the village. That did produce what seems to be Anglo-Saxon archaeology. So it's a big, big site. One of the troubles with digging in the village is there's a whole medieval, post-medieval midden has grown up on top. So we'd have to go down 1.5 meters, 2 meters to get to the Anglo-Saxon. Where we are over in the fields, we've taken topsoil off and we're straight down onto the Anglo-Saxon. So that's why we're there on the edges. Also, people don't want their gardens dug up. So,
Lady behind.
It's not the stone sculptures. We dated the bone associated with the stone sculptures. So that bone comes in from 8th, 9th, 10th century. So no, we're not actually doing the bone, the sculpture itself. It's very good of you to spot that. It's the associated bone.
Let me ask you a question to go on from that, because you said very briefly, you showed us what you believe to be an Anglo-Saxon church building, which you are unable to date.
Yeah.
You then said, we're thinking about how we might be able to date it.
Yeah.
What kind of thoughts have been going around in your mind?
I've got two thoughts. Let's just go back to that picture. First of all, is the way in which the stone has been worked. There are a lot more slides than I remember. Let's start. Okay, there we go. So there's quite crude tooling, very crude mine tools on that, which we couldn't, when they dug it, they couldn't find any parallels to that in the church. In our trench, we have started to pick up stones which have a very similar tooling. So it might be that those are going to turn into structures we can date through other means, through dating associated material. So that's one way. Also, I'm not very much not a science archaeologist. I go out and dig holes, but using things like optical stimulated luminescence and some of the more advanced dating techniques, you actually may be able to date where the bottom of these stones or the underlying soil last saw daylight. So some of these techniques may help us. But again, all these things, they have a broad and always with the science things, it's never quite right for the technical people. They'll always tell you this wonderful story about what they can do. And when you get to the site, it's either too old or too young or not been moved or being moved too much. So we'll have to see whether that actually works out in the end. I hope my colleagues aren't watching this.
It was lovely when you said we may be able to find out when these stones first saw daylight. There were lots of smiles on the faces of the audience, like we're getting these new technologies which can tell us even more narratives. This is a great time to be living in as far as dating is concerned.
Not just dating, but just the techniques. So I had one of my colleagues out from the department last week, and we were looking at the landscape, and she's a geoarchaeologist, and the things you can do with DNA in the soil and the geochemistry, and it's really hard for me because I don't even know what questions I can ask because I don't know. The techniques are moving so quickly. They're kind of finding information almost before we can ask the questions. So it's an interesting dialogue between the technical people and people like me. So yeah.
Taking it back to Mick, I remember Mick saying that some of the stuff that they used on the moon, they were able to read the various amounts of chemicals in the different areas that they were observing. And he was predicting that very soon, in the same way that we do geophys as far as solid stuff is concerned, we would be able to do that as far as chemicals were concerned, and then we would be able to uncover all sorts of evidence about where people lived and where they grew.
There's people in Durham working on livestock and using geochemistry to pick up where livestock is, and because there's different hormones between male and female wee, you can actually pick up where you've got dairy and male and female stock being held in different areas. So this is what I mean. I'd never even thought of asking that.
Yeah,
the techniques come through so fast. It's great. It's fun.
More questions. Lady in green up the back.
Yeah, I mean, we're always talking to the islanders. We're always talking to the people who could both represent the islanders themselves, but also things like the Heritage Centre and English Heritage. Obviously, we've already got stuff coming through on the internet or the social media. Obviously, this is a research excavation, so we'll be bringing out proper publications. We're working on digital reconstructions at the moment. We've got a whole program of ideas of how to get this stuff out. And I think the most important thing is I want to see the objects coming back to the island. I think that's absolutely key. They need to be displayed in some way, some form here for the people to see. And also that goes, I should say, that's happening with the bones, human bone as well. We're digging them up, but they're going to come back and we're going to get them back in that churchyard.
There's a lady up there.
I'm a skeptic. I'll be honest. I am a skeptic. There are plans in the church which show amazing, elaborate reconstructions. One of the great things about the GPR, that gives us a chance to compare the dowsing with the GPR, and I think in that kind of contest, I'd be with the GPR, to be honest. I'm always happy to be proved wrong, but yeah, I'm a skeptic.
Yes.
There's no bodies up here. They've not found any. There's no sign of them. Yes, people did bury in churches, but also they're buried around churches as well. But not every church had burials. So they could have been other chapels or other uses. Maybe particularly somewhere like Lindisfarne, people processing around just like the bishops, moving around that landscape, having different religious ceremonies and practices at various places around the landscape. Not all churches would be burial. But we know from Bede there's a cemetery of the brothers. We know by kind of logical deduction there's another cemetery, presumably where our children and women and our people are being buried. It's a reference to the cemetery of St. Columba. We don't even know where that is. So there are multiple burials everywhere. It's a whole kind of necrogeography of kind of dead people everywhere.
Is that really a phrase?
It is now. It is now. Yeah. You heard it here first.
Okay. Well, I'm going to scan my eyes across this piece of necrogeography. Anybody on this side want to ask a question? Yes, gentlemen.
That's a really good question. It's one of these first year essay questions we set first year archaeologists. Is archaeology destruction? Yes, you dig it up. It's on the spoiled heap or in a museum. One of the great things about Holy Island, because there's been so little work done, that's not a major issue at the moment. We're obviously not, when you go and see the trench, it's a big field. We're digging maybe 2 or 3% of it. We've got no plans to do more work in that field. So it's going to be there for a long time. It's not protected though. At the moment, it's not scheduled by Historic England. The area inside the Priory is protected. So our area isn't, but it's not under threat because it's not being ploughed. It's just used for grass and tourists, the two main things going through there. But yeah, in other situations, you'd always be aware that if you destroy something, you are stopping future archaeologists going and finding out more. Absolutely.
There is the obverse of that question, which I know the Theoretical Archaeology Group has been wrestling with for a number of years, which is, should we be digging up anything at all? When you think of how limited, ultimately, the amount of archaeology there is, and when you think of all the stuff there is in museums, and museums all over the country are constantly complaining, please don't give us any more stuff. We don't know where to put it, and we certainly don't know where to preserve it. And so I think it was a rather helpful question, I think. Should we actually dig anything at all? One of the things that people like Francis Pryor argues is, well, there's some stuff that you've just got to dig, because otherwise people are just going to put pile drivers through it because we need a new Tesco's or whatever. So a degree of rescue archaeology needs to be done. And also, you need constantly to be training up the next generation of archaeologists. So it's very important that those skills remain. But given the fact that so many of the archaeological sites that have been dug over the last 100 years, including a hell of a lot out of archaeology departments, the reports have never seen the light of day. And you go into the houses of some archaeologists when they died, you look under the bed, and there's trays and trays and trays of unrecorded stuff. There is an argument, I think, which would challenge the notion that if you see something that's interesting, you ought to pick it up straight away.
It's not something we do lightly. It's not something we do just for the hell of it. We're going in with questions. We're doing it carefully. We're thinking about what we're after. We don't just strip it off and see what happens. I mean, it's maybe they did 150 years ago, but now it's a careful, drawn out, thoughtful process. And yeah, all those things Tony said are absolutely right. We need to think about the impact, the legacy of the archives and how those end up. But we need to train archaeologists. I mean, my students need to learn to dig. And bar making, virtual excavations, there's nothing like seeing a site from the end of the trowel. I think that's a really important part of development. And also, all the new techniques, which will be used in the future, they need to be developed too. So it's part of the process.
Somebody else? Yes. The Holy Grail would be to find the Holy Grail.
Yes.
Do you think it's likely you'll find it in some of the places where you're digging, or is it perhaps really underneath the Priory?
I suspect the earliest church is under the Priory. When they dug this church here, one of the things when I visited, I was looking for was to see whether I could see any signs of an early wooden structure underneath, and there was just nothing there. And they're a really good team who did this, and they would have picked it up. I suspect that the earliest thing would have been down, probably under the later Abbey Church or under the parish church. And that's a problem, is English Heritage aren't going to let us knock down that Priory Church. The locals are unlikely to let us dig up the cemetery. I think that's where it lies. Hopefully the GPR will help us at least maybe find some of the stone churches, but the wooden church is going to be very difficult. And of course, Finnan's wooden church, the second church, was preserved and then taken to Norham anyway. It was like an IKEA church where you were able to, they kept the Allen key and moved it and got it to Norham.
Somebody else over there? Yes, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they come back a little bit before because they see the Normans coming and they hightail it out of Durham. They take Cuthbert and they come all the way back here before this priory is built. And I think that's a suggestion but there must have been something there for them to come back to. I don't think they just speculatively came to a small island. I think there would have been people there to welcome them. So I think there's a monastic presence all the way through. It's just that the relics of Cuthbert, which is the kind of the head office, the registered office of the monastery, they moved. Yeah, that's why they moved them back. And then once they came to a smooth and orderly transition with the Normans, and everyone was happy that they'd either lost their jobs or been reappointed to a new post, and it was clear that they're going to keep their lands, Cuthbert comes back to Durham because he's so symbolic of this part of the world.
I made a documentary series earlier in the year for Channel 5 called Britain's Greatest Cathedrals. It's really pissed the Scots off because they were all in England. But one of them was Durham, and in that I perpetuated the myth which you've just undermined of the monks going around with Cuthbert's body, schlepping around for a couple of centuries, finally ending up in Durham. And those of you who have been to Durham will know that there's a really good sculpture, isn't there, in the shadow of the cathedral of all these guys going around carrying Cuthbert. Do you think that whole notion of that kind of perambulation is myth and is merely symbolising a much more practical administrative movement of bones?
They clearly moved. I mean, we know the monks of Iona, they moved. They went over to Ireland, and monasteries do move. But I think, when you think about those of you who remember your Sunday school, is what is the great movement of people? It's a movement of the Jews from Egypt to the chosen land, and that's such a powerful myth, such a powerful allegory for a community who moves. I think what happens is they try and kind of map their history onto the Bible, because our Norman historians, they're not historians as we'd understand it. They're writing a providential history. They're writing a religious history. Of course, the great thing about Holy Island, it's like the Red Sea. The tides part, they come together again, and there's all this symbolism. And these monks, they write with allegory and metaphor, and I think that's what they're seeing when they go back and look at their own history. They rewrite their own stories.
My 3-minute lady has sent me another. Do you guys want to have a little break, or would you rather go straight on to Helen? Straight on. Well, if anybody doesn't need to sneak out, then don't worry about it. Please do that. But can you all give a big round today for?